This is your content lecture on Etruscan art. The Etruscan heartland is the area that's present-day Tuscany, so between the Arno and the Tiber rivers. We'll look at a map of it shortly. It's not an empire, but rather a group of cities. What they shared was a basis in religion. They were all run by conservative monarchies, and they all believe in life after death. They're very influenced by Greek culture, and yet they're different as well. And so that's what we'll be looking at a lot today. What ends up happening to the Etruscans is that they get taken over by Rome, which is a republic at that point and is becoming, moving towards its imperial status, which we'll be talking about next week. All right, so here's our map, and you can see that it's basically this group of cities, largely around here between the Arno and the Tiber. And so Rome is just on the edge of it. We'll be spending some time in Cerveteri especially, but also Tarquinia, and we'll be looking at a temple in Volci. So none of the Etruscan architecture survives. The only thing we have to go on is a description by the Roman architect Vitruvius. And based on this description, scholars have reconstructed what the temples probably looked like. And so here it is. There's a lot here that seems Greek, right? It's got a pediment. It has columns. It has a stylobate, so it has a base that sets it up away from everything else. It has a porch off the front. That's similar to the Greek temple too. However, for the most part, it's very different. If you look at the plan, there's actually multiple rooms rather than one rectangular room. It doesn't have the same symmetry. Also, as we'll talk about, it doesn't have sculpture in the same place. All the sculpture is around the top. And now that we've talked about the Etruscan temple style, I think this Hera temple that we looked at back in the Archaic period will make more sense. So we said this looks totally like a Greek temple, except it's got these two entrances. That's weird. Well, it's not that weird in Etruria, where this was built. And they think that there were probably two deities that were worshipped here, and that's probably what was happening in the Etruscan temple as well. So now we're going to talk about some Etruscan sculpture. This sculpture was on the roof of the temple that Vitruvius described. We'll be looking at this guy here. This is the most complete of the sculpture from the roof of the Portinaccio temple. It is a sculpture of Apollo, although the Etruscan name for him was Apullu. So the Etruscans had the same pantheon of gods as the Greeks. They modified their names slightly, so they believed many of the same things as the Greeks did. And this guy, in many ways, as we'll discuss, looks very similar to archaic Greek sculpture. He has the archaic smile. He has the braided hair. He has a mask-like appearance. However, he's very dynamic, right? Look at the way he's leaning forward and gesturing towards the viewer. Although these are really meant to be seen in profile like this, because you can imagine them up on top of the temple. They're made of terracotta and were originally painted. And this is pretty masterful, because if you imagine that the clay had to be wet when they fired it, it took a lot of careful planning to be able to create a sculpture of this size. It's almost 6 feet tall. That wouldn't collapse on itself before the firing. So you can see that they're highly skilled at that. His robe has patterned drapery, so it creates a pattern through here. Doesn't seem particularly naturalistic, but you can see there's interest in the musculature of his legs. So he was one of 4 sculptures up there that they're pretty sure represented one of Hercules' labors when he's trying to get the Cimmerian hind, basically a special deer that was sacred to Artemis. Artemis is Apollo's sister. And so after Hercules attacks the hind, the deer, Artemis and Apollo go after him, but then he begs for forgiveness and it all works out for Hercules. Let's compare the Apollo more closely with the Anavisos here, because you can see they're from around the same time, maybe 20 years apart, and there's so many similarities. Again, the things we said before, the smile, the braid, that mask-like features, but in general, Etruscan sculpture and art is just much more lively, much more engaged. The way that he's taking the one step forward, but he's really leaning into it. He looks like he's running, about to spring. The way the arms are gesturing out. All of these things really distinguish Etruscan art from the Greek, besides the fact that they are definitely, or in spite of the fact that they're very much inspired by Greek sculpture. So now we're going to talk about some of their burial practices. So the Etruscans would make these vast necropoli. A necropolis is a city of the dead. Wealthy families would have tombs in these necropoli, and they were set up almost like cities. Like literally they had streets and houses, and you can kind of see that in here. So this is in Bonditaccia. And you will be looking at tumuli like these round ones shortly. So here are some of the rock-cut tombs, which in many ways are similar to the Egyptians. And honestly, their worldview is similar to the Egyptians. They believe in full life after death, and that is reflected in the way that they're decorating the interiors of these tombs. So here's another view. These are called tumuli because of the rounded roofs. And then here's another one. The singular is tumulus. It's basically a burial mound, but these are all cut out of the earth. Let's take some time to look at the interiors of these tombs. They're laid out similarly to the way an Etruscan home would be organized. So if you look at this one, this is where they would put urns with the ashes of the deceased because they cremated their deceased, but it's set up almost like their beds on here, right? And then there's a chair. It's like there's windows on the wall, even though all of this is underground. Here is a plan of that tomb, the tomb of the shields and the chairs. That you can see that it is literally like you would walk into the house. So, and here's the main room, and then you can go over to these side rooms. And this is really helpful for art historians because it gives you a sense of what their domestic architecture was like as well. This is probably one of the best ones. It's called the Tomb of the Reliefs in Cerveteri. And this is remarkable because they have all of this stucco fresco or stuccoed sculptures all over the walls. So these are all, this is stucco that was put on there and then sculpted into objects. And so you get a sense of all of the different objects that they wanted with them in the afterlife, including perhaps their dogs. So there's a dog right here. But they're everyday tools like cooking utensils and weapons. If you look over here, there's a kylix, so that same type of wine pot that we talked about back in the archaic Greek period. This is also interesting because it really reflects domestic architecture. So we'll see this especially when we get to Imperial Rome and we learn more about domestic architecture, but the main courtyard of a home would often have a pool for catching rainwater right here, and it's as if it imitates that, and then it has columns around it. And look, the columns have voluted capitals, so they're really trying to make it look like a space that would be familiar to them. Over here you can see that there are mythological creatures. So this is Cerberus, the three-headed dog that's guarding the gates of the dead. And then here's another mythological figure associated with the afterlife. So there are some religious things here, but mostly it's about Etruscan lifestyles. And again, they cremated their deceased, and so this would be filled with funerary urns with ashes. It's not like a body would lie here, although these look like pillows. This is another example of the interior of a tomb, and this one is noteworthy because it is frescoed. So we learned about fresco in the prehistoric Aegean when we looked at the bull leaping. This uses that same technique, and what they're doing here is they're representing a giant party, basically. So There are all these people reclining on clinae. Clinae are dining couches. There's people dancing. There's animals eating the scraps off the floor. There's servants serving the people wine and food. And it's almost as if this is the ceiling of a tent and you're outdoors. And the really remarkable thing about this is you have to remember it's all inside. And so this is underground. It would be horribly dark, but here they use fresco to completely transform the space. This is something that you see a lot of in Italian art, even moving into past the chronological extent of our class. So here is from the early Italian Renaissance, similar, this artist Mantegna completely transforms the space. The most famous one is, of course, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. But then moving into the Baroque period, you have these completely crazy frescoes that explode the ceilings of the rooms into this fantasy painted space. I really think you can trace all of this interest in illusionism and in using frescoes to transform interiors all the way back to the Etruscans. This is the last object that we'll look at together in our lecture. This is a sarcophagus with a reclining couple, but it's basically a giant funerary urn. The cremated ashes of the deceased were placed in here. So you can see we have a man and a woman reclining on a clinae, a dining couch. That's the same thing that we saw in that fresco just a moment ago. And it looks like they are talking to you, right? The woman is gesturing. The man is maybe holding a glass of wine here, he used to be, and maybe a plate for her here to eat. But they seem very engaged with you as the viewer. If you look at this view of it, you can see even more how she's gesturing, talking with her hands. And this relates to Etruscan culture because they were known to be great entertainers. There are descriptions, contemporaries who write about how they would lay out their tables with so much food that it was unbelievable. And those of you with an Italian heritage might recognize that. And it's interesting to think that it has very deep roots. Also, the idea of Italians talking with their hands, you could even trace that to the Etruscans if you look at the way the woman here is communicating through hand gestures. This is a view of it from behind, and this should make you think of archaic Greek art a little bit. They both have that braided hair, they have that smooth mask-like face, but really that's where the similarities end. If you look at the sarcophagus with the reclining couple on the left in comparison to the Greek little bronze on the right that's in the same position, you can see that the Greeks are far more interested in anatomy and how the body moves and should operate. They're interested in naturalism. The Etruscans aren't. If you look at the legs here, they look like they're too long, they're too flat. I mean, they look completely disjointed from the bodies. This is an impossible position that in which they sit, whereas the Greek seems far more natural. However, this is also a good comparison because these dining couches and sitting up and talking while on a dining couch, that's something that happened at a symposium. If you remember the way we talked about symposia back in Greek, the only women that would participate in a symposium were prostitutes. This shows that in Etruscan culture, women played a much more significant role, and we know that to be true also from the same accounts that I described earlier. And we see that literally embedded within this sarcophagus. And you can imagine it within one of those tombs like we saw before. It must have been a really comforting thing for family members to come and see their grandparents or whoever still engaging and talking and throwing parties and giving their opinions and just enjoying their afterlife just as much as they enjoyed their life. So one last thing. The one we've been looking at is from the Via Giulia in Rome, but this one is almost the same exact thing, and it's at the Louvre. And it's really interesting to me to think that that type of sarcophagus was a trope, that it was a trendy thing that you would buy, because sometimes it just seems so individualized. But it's interesting to see that many people wanted to be memorialized in just that way. Anyway, that's it for the Etruscans. Now we'll move on to the Roman Republic.